Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session on children and young adult consumers, reaching them safely and effectively. We're going to have a panel discussion. I'm encouraging our participants to debate with one another. I'm not sure that they're going to. And we're going to start with everybody taking a few minutes to say who they are and what they do and introduce themselves to you. So we're going to start with Leanne.
Hi, I'm actually going to quite formally head over to the lectern. I've got a few slides. Hello everyone, I am Leanne. I am Business Director at Liberty, and we're an award-winning youth engagement agency who share our space, as you can see here, with young people every day to co-create campaigns, communities and content, and in return provide those young people with access to kind of inspiration, training and opportunities. My role there is to lead strategic and effective delivery of our work and deliver business benefits for clients like Public Health England, Google, Channel 4, Penguin, and simultaneously ensure that we give measurable social impact to those young people that we're engaging. So, in action, what that actually means is projects like Spine Breakers, which we run in partnership with Penguin, which is an online community for teens who love books, and Spine Breakers teens there can curate content around their favourite titles and feed in unique youth insight back into Penguin. So I just wanted to use my few minutes to briefly share a couple of campaigns and projects that I've led the delivery of to give a bit of context to some of the opinions that I'll be sharing later, and also showcase what I believe it means to kind of reach children and young people consumers safely and effectively using digitally led strategies that engage young people, and hopefully provide some inspiration from slightly wider than the publishing industry. So first up is a project that we led called The Stake. It's in partnership with Channel 4 and Barclays, and last year won an MAA award. In looking for a way to kind of engage young people effectively through digital to learn about something that's really quite unsexy as financial literacy, we needed to kind of real life element and put a large sum of money up for grabs, £100,000, for young people to collectively pitch ideas about how they would use a share of that money to improve their communities, and then also for other young people to vote and those ideas and collectively decide how that money would be spent. They were completing kind of fun financial challenges, which really kind of tapped into the sort of zeitgeist of the sort of do-it-yourself generation. So there was an opportunity there to engage them through these content-led and digital games. Also, here's the 401 show. So I've led the development and delivery of an innovative content strategy for Public Health England to drive peer-to-peer conversations between 11 to 15-year-olds around risky behaviours such as smoking, drugs, sex and relationships, which in turn will build their resilience and reduce their propensity to undertake those kind of behaviours. As Rosie said, YouTube really is the kind of platform for the video-first generation. So that's where we've based our content strategy. We bill it as the YouTube support group for teenage humans, and created a weekly show, The 401, fronted by a vlogger called Jimmy, supported by talent and experts, and engages young people around our topics. We actively ask the audience for comments and interaction, and then hero and reflect those comments back through the content we create, promoting positive norms. We pose some really important questions for young people, like, do pubes ever really stop growing? And find a way to build that. It's really important with that young age range to find a way to build that sort of safe space online for those conversations. We're up at nearly 20,000 subscriptions, thousands of comments, and 1.2 million video views and counting. And then finally, just wanted to show you Zip It. This is a app that we've just produced for Childline, an anti-sexting app. It's such a sensitive topic, and actually there are real challenges around how to deliver an anti-sexting message to young people, particularly when the majority of this selfie generation don't actually see this as an issue, and that sharing those explicit images is actually quite commonplace. And whilst they're aware that there's situations are potentially unsafe, they're just kind of completely unprepared with how to deal with them when they arise. by tapping into kind of popular online meme culture that young people are really passionate about. We created an app with a set of memes designed to easily send and share if you were a young person who was asked to send an inappropriate image, or if you were sent an image that you found inappropriate. You could respond with a really embarrassing bird and awkward, or hedgehog, and that's not how I roll. Because of the kind of empowering and non-preachy way that we approach sort of a tricky subject, it's provided young people a way to effectively and safely sort of diffuse an awkward or uncomfortable situation, and seen a fantastic response of over 40,000 downloads in a few weeks. So that's me and some of the things that I've been doing. I hope that was interesting. Thank you very much.
We're going to go, because he's here, to Joe Godwin next.
And what's the answer to the pubes question?
You'll have to wait and find out. Go to the website.
I think they go grey first, Joe.
All right, OK. I think let's change the subject. I'm Joe Godwin, and I'm the director of the Children's Services of the BBC. I'm sure most of you are aware what the BBC is. It's a publicly funded public service broadcaster, although it's a lot more than that, and I think that's relevant to what we're talking about today. I'm responsible for the services that the BBC makes especially for children, which is different from things that children like or consume. It's the things that are targeted at children, which is principally 2 television channels, CBeebies for preschool children and CBBC for school-aged children. They both have websites, they both have iPlayers, and as of last week, they both have YouTube channels. What you may not know is that the UK is probably the most complex children's broadcasting and video media economy in the world. There are only 12 million children in the UK, and sometimes it feels like they've each got their own kids' TV channel. There are over 30 dedicated digital TV channels for children. I'm pleased to say that out of those 32 channels, the 2 channels on TV run by the BBC are by a long way the most popular, reaching between a third and half of their targeted audience each week. And that isn't just satisfying because I'm competitive, it's satisfying because it should reassure us all that children are very discerning in their media choices. Children don't always want the easiest watch, the most passive watch. CBBC in particularly, which ever since BBC started making content especially for children, which was in the 1920s, and on television since the 1940s, the vision of BBC Children's Services has been to create a miniature version of the BBC, of public service content in all genres, specially made for children by specialists who understand their needs. So CBBC is a multi-genre channel which goes all the way from a daily news service through comedy and drama, factual entertainment, and all the other genres you would expect. And I think for that to be the most chosen TV channel is, as I say, it's reassuring about how children make active choices, about having their curiosity satisfied by stimulating content. And that should reassure us all that despite what you might read in the papers, children still are hungry and thirsty for information and to find out about how the world works. The big changes for BBC Children's over the last few years have obviously been about the delivery and the way children consume our media. Huge uptake led by children of the BBC's iPlayer, the video on demand service, much higher use of that than there is from adults, although it's still less than 10% of the consumption of our content. And I think for me, the challenges that we're facing are as much about how we deliver stuff as to what it is. I still think whether it's books, whether it's television, whether it's games, children are still looking to have their curiosity satisfied, to be made to laugh and to enjoy high quality storytelling. The challenges are about how you deliver that and the means that you do that. The other thing that I think is preoccupying us a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as well, is how in a hugely fragmented children's media market, you keep children safe, because the media choices children have and the devices with which they have opportunity to use are unimaginable compared to when I was a child. My media choices as a child were 2 television channels, read a book, talk to somebody. Those were the options. There are so many millions of options now. And we also know that households in the UK with children, over 50% of them have a tablet device. Again, it's way higher than households without children. So children is always a driving technological change. Families with children are driving uptake of new technologies. And the challenge is in a fragmented market where children can go and do so many things, often which their parents don't understand what they're doing, provide new challenges around child safety and child protection. So that, in a nutshell, is what BBC Children's does and some of the things that are facing us at the moment.
Thank you. And now to Matt.
Hi there. I'll be very quick. So my name's Matt Locke. I started a company in 2011 called Story Things, and we help a variety of people, from publishers to film companies to TV companies to brands, understand how you tell stories online. But probably more pertinent for this panel, in 2007 I went from the BBC to Channel 4 to run their education team, who was commissioning content for 14 to 19-year-olds. And they'd just made the decision to shift the entire budget to about £6 million a year from making TV programming, which was being broadcast in the morning schedule during term time, which was not the best way of reaching 14 to 19-year-olds. And they decided to shift it entirely online. So I brought with me Alice Taylor, and we spent about 3.5 years finding out how do you reach audiences. So this was around 2007, 2008, 2009, just as we were starting to see more and more young people spending more time, particularly on social networks. So we commissioned lots of really interesting games, YouTube projects, some great projects. I think The Stake actually was from a later team at Channel 4 Education. And basically what we do at Story Things has really been informed by my experience commissioning and understanding the way in which you engage and find audiences online. And we have a shorthand at Story Things, which really cheesily is an ABC, and it's kind of accidental that it is. But we think about three things. We think about the attention pattern. You know, how are people going to find the time in their day to find and engage with your stories? Is it something that's going to be a repeated habit, a kind of snacking habit of dropping in and out of a story throughout the day? Is it going to be a synchronous event, like a live broadcast, where your entire audience gets together to watch something at the same time? Or, you know, what are those new attention patterns? And one of the things I really noticed in the time I spent at Channel 4 was seeing new attention patterns mature across all demographics of audiences. You know, we've kind of broken away from the idea that stories have to be a certain length, and they're not just getting shorter. We're seeing attention patterns from, you know, snacking games like Flappy Bird and virtually every other game that's got bird in the title, right through to, you know, binge viewing of Netflix comedy and drama, or playing AAA console games. So it's not that attention patterns are getting shorter, they're kind of exploding upwards and downwards. The B of our ABC is behaviours. Now we can not only just watch stories or listen to them or read them, but we can engage with them. And I'm very interested in understanding what behaviours does your audience already understand to do. So if you're designing for an audience, knowing the behaviours they already have in their kind of vocabulary is more important than designing something that teaches them a new behaviour, because we know that teaching an audience a completely new behaviour is something that people will only do if they really, really, really badly want the thing that you're offering them. It's much easier to understand and work with the behaviours they have in place. So as Joe says, you know, particularly for younger audiences, those behaviours are the ones that we're used to around tablets and smartphones. So downloading, swiping, tapping, kind of like, you know, all of these types of behaviours are really important now. And then the C of the ABC is circulation, recognising that for many of us now who live a lot of our daily media lives in streams of social content, you now find more stories or as many stories via social circulation as you do from traditional distribution. So rather than hearing about something because you've read it in the newspaper or you've seen an advert or, you know, you've switched the TV on and seen what's there, you hear about something because people you follow are sharing it and recommending it. And there is a fundamental different quality to the kinds of stories that survive well and thrive in a world of circulation compared to the ones that survive in a world of distribution. And Rebecca and the team at YouTube talked a bit about that earlier on today. So at Story Things, we're really interested in how you tell stories in a world of circulation. Okay.
And Roy.
Hi, I'm Roy Edmonds, and I'm an independent digital consultant. So my background is that I've worked in digital media for the past 18 years. I know it's hard to believe looking at me. Around 10 of which have been focused on the kids and family sector. Initially at BBC Children's, where I headed up the CBBC part of BBC Children's interactive proposition, leading a number of BAFTA-winning projects and hopefully leading BBC Children's to become the third most popular destination online within the BBC after news and sport. From there, I transitioned to Disney, where I was responsible for their digital portfolio, for their original movies, and for their Disney Channel content. So working on brands as diverse as Hannah Montana and High School Musical. And in 2008, moved to Nickelodeon, where I worked as digital director for 4 years across a vast array of content types. So things like virtual worlds, apps, video on demand, websites, mobiles, on anything and everything from SpongeBob to South Park. So also part of my focus was on slightly older audiences, teens and young adults. And then last year, very, very briefly, moved to the charity sector, where I worked for the NSPCC and Childline, focused on digital fundraising and campaigning, and looking at the audience in from a very different perspective, and focusing even more heavily on issues around child safety and best practice online. And now, as I mentioned at the start, I'm working as a digital consultant, largely focused on how you can develop brands and IP across a range of platforms, and thinking about if you're a broadcaster, how it can extend to consumer product lines or as an app, as well as looking at things like user experience and research. Because I think the most important thing, certainly from my perspective, is that none of us can claim to be children as they are now, and that kind of insight creates the best products for companies, and it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to start actually with looking at our topic. So children and young adult consumers, reaching them safely and effectively. So there was loads of words in there that if I was writing an essay, I'd be underlining and wanting to question. And I'm going to probably start with that first line, which is children and young adult consumers. So firstly, consumers. At what age do you think, when is it okay to think about children as consumers? And what's the difference between a child consumer and a young adult consumer, and how many, I guess, gradations of difference might there be? And I think I'm going to start with Matt on that one.
I knew I should have looked at you as you
Yeah,
asked.
look at me intently.
I have a huge issue with the word consumer for lots of reasons, and I want to slightly unpick that. There was some great research from actually BBC New Media's team, research, a woman called Holly Goodyear, who, if you're really interested in kind of how behaviours are changing, her research that she publishes on the BBC blog is really, really good. And she did something in 2012 which kind of exploded a lot of myths people have about behaviour online. If you were in the first wave of kind of social networks and audiences adopting the web in the 2000s, there was a shorthand for how you saw audience behaviour, which was the 99:1 ratio. So everyone assumed that 90% of people went online to broadly consume and experience and watch content. 9% would do some kind of relatively low-level participation, and then you had a 1% of hardcore people who would edit Wikipedia and run blogs and all that kind of stuff. And the BBC research in 2012 shown that actually that's just not true anymore. That actually only about 17% of the audience are truly what you might call passive users of the web, so they just go on and they just consume content. A much larger percentage, and I'm going to not remember these exactly, so don't do the maths, but around 65% engage in what they call easy interaction. And this is basically what's happened post Facebook and Twitter. Before 2007, if you wanted to talk about what you liked online, you still had to be reasonably geeky. You had to run a blog, or you had to kind of use one of those early kind of Web 2.0 tools, and they were never going to go very mainstream. What Facebook and Twitter did in 2007 was made that sharing and circulating activity very, very mainstream indeed. And of course, Pinterest and Tumblr and loads of others have followed on and done that since. And then there is a much larger percentage, again, over a kind of 10-15% percentage, who do actively curate, who share photos, who kind of make work themselves. So I would first of all just kind of stake a knife in the heart of that word consumer and say that actually if you're thinking about reaching children or young people right now, thinking about them as consumers is probably a very, very bad starting place.
Do you agree with that, Joe?
I think so. I'm confused by the word consumer, which to me conjures up ideas about commercial transactions. And I think children have always been consumers in that sense, since since the wheel was square, children have saved up their pocket money to buy things. So there's nothing new about children as commercial consumers. The bit I'm more concerned about is making a distinction between children and young people. And I think a definition of children is quite useful. It's useful for me in what I do, because I think, and there are millions of definitions of children. There's legal definitions, which mean anybody under the age of 18 is a child in the eyes of the law. You don't meet many 17-year-olds who want to be described as a child. And I think the notion of children as distinct from teenagers and adolescents, children who haven't reached puberty, children who haven't reached adolescence, in terms of what we do, is the most useful thing. And those are children who, and they are children because they're not necessarily making all their own decisions, they're still part of families, and they're still subject to the financial decisions and other jurisdiction of their parents. So I think children have always been consumers. I think children, in my definition of children, which is pre-adolescent children, are very much consumers of all sorts of media, both commercially consumers of it, but also users of it, which might be a more useful word. I think they're very different to adolescents, though, in the sense that we mustn't think that because they've got smartphones and Facebook accounts that they're adults, because they're not. Part of the problem of the invention of teenageness in the sort of post-war period is there's been a blurring between where childhood ends and adulthood begins. And I think one of the risks around that is that we forget children are not grown-ups. And increasingly in this modern world, they have the trappings of being grown-ups. They sometimes have the language and the clothes of being grown-ups, but they're not. So I think for me, a definition of children is the most important thing. Then we know who we're worrying about. And I think children, teenagers, adults are more helpfully looked at as three different audiences.
And so that blurring, I think, of children into adults and thinking about reaching them safely and effectively, that's a lot of what you think about, Lee, isn't it? And do you want to talk a bit about, you know, where you start drawing those lines and how you talk to and reach them in different ways?
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting to think about kind of where childhood ends and where young adults start. We actually have quite a very broad definition of a young person, which can sometimes go straight up to almost like early 20s. But definitely thinking about looking at something like the 401 show, where that's aimed at a very young age range, 11 to 15-year-olds, and actually trying to talk to them about very old subjects or topics that can be considered really subjects that can be considered much older than their age range, actually is quite a challenge. So around that particularly, we talk about how what angles we use for the topics, and think a lot about which ways we would focus those young people. I think there's a challenge in the way that I'll talk about things, because obviously we're not talking about a product that will be that is like an end goal selling. So I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic when I'm talking about campaigns or work.
You're talking about information.
Yeah, and sharing of services and things like that. I think that there's definitely an age range around sort of 14 where we draw a line in terms of more of the adult angles. So when we're trying to talk about issues that, around sex and relationships, we look at actually, you know, pre-13, 14, what you would discuss there, versus post-14 and to 16. So an example being talking about sex in the context of relationships versus actually maybe post-14, 15, 16 sex in its much wider forms.
And so, interestingly, though, talking about, and you touched on it, Joe, and you did as well, Matt, but I'm going to ask Roy, you know, this idea about, so you talk about sex in one way up until, you know, the age of, say, 14, and then you talk about it in a different way, but it's all the wild west of the internet. So how do you actually direct that conversation at the right places and protect them from hearing about, you know, what we don't think they're ready for yet?
I think the challenge with children is that every single year they develop. So and we tend to focus products in a very compartmentalized way, and I think that's a reflection of perhaps the broadcast media space that I've worked in. So you'll have preschool propositions, and you'll have propositions aimed at 7 to 12-year-old, and then you'll slip into the sort of teen market, which I'd argue from a broadcast perspective is sort of woefully underserved in terms of a sort of an overarching brand identity. I think I'd kind of go back to my experience of using things like community tools and social media where those brands are to engage with that audience. A lot of the research that I've done has shown that children tend to use things like social media to chat amongst peers rather than engage with brands. So it's how you initiate a conversation around quite difficult issues. And certainly with something like the BBC, I mean, my experience of the BBC in tackling things like sex education and that sort of thing, it was often quite challenging, because on the one hand you've got the BBC policy face of things, of what you can and can't do, and I'm saying this not working there, I'm sort of looking at Joe slightly nervously, but then you've got the other side where you understand how those kids do want to talk about those things, and it's quite difficult to find the balance. And that's the same thing at the NSPCC and Childline. Childline, you've got a brand that, to all sense and purposes, Childline says to me under 12s, but actually it's aimed at a far older audience, and it sends out quite mixed messages around what it should be sharing with that audience. I don't know whether that was your experience when you were creating that product that you presented earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a real challenge, because obviously we're talking about pre-16-year-olds, and then actually saying, having a conversation with them about sharing explicit images, which both of those things sort of, as adults, feel really, really far removed. Like, why would a 14-year-old be sharing an explicit image? But it is a challenge when kind of trying to walk that fine line. I think what we found there was uncovering, talking to them directly and uncovering the insight in the fact that actually it's about not thinking about what they're asking for. So asking for, a sexy picture, not really understanding what that means, because they are still children, even though they're kind of playing in the sort of adult's world, is where a lot of this was coming from. And once you would kind of uncover that and find a way to position it in a young person's space, actually what they're asking for is inappropriate and could make someone feel uncomfortable or awkward, but in kind of a light-hearted and sort of empowering way, so that it makes them feel less scared or silly to say something in that kind of young people's way, where they'll feel embarrassed or that they'll lose face. So I think that, walking that fine line is how you can kind of uncover that insight and find out why they're doing that or why that behaviour is happening, and then use that as a way to flip the way that you approach that conversation with them, but still kind of bearing in mind their age.
Matt wanted to say something else.
I mean, Zip It's a really good example of something which I think is fundamental to understanding issues of safety online, particularly of younger audiences, and it recognises the fact that the internet is not one space. When we started commissioning at Channel 4, we needed to come up with a framework of explaining to, this is back in 2007, 2008, of explaining both to TV companies and to digital companies what we meant by the internet. And we were very, very clear that it was, it wasn't all the same, and that actually individual spaces and individual products on the internet create different ideas and kind of expectations of social behaviour. So we had this kind of 6 spaces framework where we said, there are private spaces where you expect to be able to talk to somebody that you know, probably directly, or to a very small group of people. You expect that conversation to be private, not to be shared, etc., etc. I mean, and teenagers in particular love secret spaces. It's why SMS was so huge. It's why WhatsApp and Snapchat and all those other kind of are now Secret and Whisper and stuff like that are so good. Then there's group spaces where you kind of feel like you know everyone and you feel confident enough to talk to them and you share an interest. And there are different spaces like participation spaces where your role is to share or create something. There's gaming spaces. There's watching spaces where you're part of a crowd. And all of us kind of know instinctively the expectations about behaviour and the edges of those types of services. And when we were young, we all had very similar spaces as kids. There was a great article in The Economist quite a few years ago now saying that mobile phones had become, for current generations, what cars were in the 60s and 70s. That there is always this transitional object as a teen, which basically has a number of qualities. It's an object which you own yourself, which your parents don't control. It's something that you can customise and explore your identity with. And it's literally the thing that physically escapes you from the network of your family into the network of your peers. And in many ways, mobile phones and the apps that are on them have become what cars were. But the biggest challenge now is that, 20, 30 years ago, for your stories, your kind of images and kind of expressions of who you are, to escape from one of those contexts to another, to go from a private conversation to a group conversation to a public conversation, was really hard. The challenge we have now is that teens are performing the same behaviours they have done since the 50s, and that's never going to change. But they're performing them in a technological environment in which the transgression of your own identity and stories can shift imperceptibly from one context to another. So, a photograph that you could share to your boyfriend or to your girlfriend could get retweeted and then shared and stuff like that. And that's really the biggest challenge we have around safety online, is that idea of transgression, of content which was shared in an understanding that it be within one social context, escaping and being shared in another. And it's a really, really, technologically, it's never going to be a problem that's technologically solved. It's one that's going to be solved through kind of like social experience, and actually through the kind of hacks. I do think Zip It is a fantastic hack to solving that social problem.
So it's complicated, and so there's like this complex matrix of various ages, obviously, and that children changing, and our idea of children, and what society kind of expectation of children changing, but also within those not walled spaces or loosely gated spaces in digital place. And of course, so for marketeers, I guess, and for those wanting to reach, send information out, broadcast to, sell to children, there's lots of different variables to consider when thinking about those messaging. Do you also think in that really complex way when thinking about developing stories for children and young people?
It is complex. It's really confusing me, all of this. I think it is terribly... I just want to pick up on something Matt said, though, about teenagers and cars, because I genuinely, without being complacent, would try to encourage people not to panic about children and technology. Because I think, and if you look at the historical perspective, which is often missing from these conversations, there have been moral panics since the dawn of time about new things and the effect they have on children. I'm sure when the hoop and stick was invented, there were people worried that it would cause moral looseness and other terrible things. And I think this happens again and again and again around technology. And I think the thing is for adults to understand what those risks are. And to Roy's point about how do broadcasters who are talking to 7 to 12-year-olds address these things, I think it's a mixture of being age appropriate in terms of advice and also helping children, even if you as a broadcaster can't talk about a subject because of the age appropriateness of it, making sure you offer directions and signposts to places where people can find out about stuff, and children will find that. And that's one of the great opportunities of this digital age, is that when I was a kid, if I'd wanted to find something out, if there wasn't a book in the library about it and I didn't want to ask my mum about it, I was buggered. And now, I think one of the great, looking positively at the benefits of digital media for kids, as long as in that great sea of information there are islands of reassurance, of security, of information and advice, I think it's a very positive thing. I can't even remember what the question was now, sorry.
Well, I don't even think we have time to restart the question because it's huge.
Metaphor which I used to use a lot at Channel 4, and there's this thing called a caddisfly, and when it's in its larva stage it kind of crawls along the riverbed and it builds itself a little coat out of rocks and pebbles and stuff like that, which basically allows it to kind of pupate and stuff. And an artist called Herbert Duprat used to take these larvae and put them in a tank filled with jewels, and so they would build these beautiful kind of coats out of small jewels and gems. And in many ways that's kind of what you do as a teen. You kind of live in this sea of really confusing information and stuff, and you start wearing bits of it to see if it suits you. Am I more like this? What do I think about this? Am I this person? Am I that person? And when teens kind of express themselves online, whether it's by customising their car or their MySpace and Bebo page back when we were working at Channel 4, or now kind of Facebook and WhatsApp, that's what they're doing. They're kind of picking up the bits of flotsam and jetsam from around culture around them and finding out if it fits for them. And I absolutely agree with you, Joe, that there are continuing moral panics about whether technology is a good or a bad thing, but for me it's not the technology, it's what those stories are that are floating around those streams. And if there are enough good ones, if there are enough jewels at the bottom of the riverbed, as well as the dross and the kind of muck, then do you know what? Kids are generally going to be okay.
But I think that the thing is that kids do just see it as stuff. That's the beauty of
creating this stuff for children. The problem is parents seem slightly divorced and disconnected from it. I think BT did a survey recently where half of all UK parents with school-age children didn't feel they were adequately informed about what their children were doing or
and
digital
the other half
media.
thought they did, and they were wrong as well.
But it just, I think it's a great thing for tabloid headlines to focus on the dangers around digital media and kids. But actually, we do need to focus on the positives. But we also need to help parents engage with this more and take greater responsibility in educating themselves. And to go back to the consumer thing that we talked about originally, educating their children about using money properly online and that sort of thing.
I'm going to have to, although I have so many questions that I didn't even start to talk about, wind us up. But I want to wind up on a sort of interesting and inspiring bit. So I want each of you to let me know something that you are incredibly excited about in the sort of children's space. So a new technology that you can see happening, or a new behaviour, or a new story, or something that's just really captured your attention and excitement. And I'm going to start with Lee.
Because I'm looking at you.
Yeah.
So it's not just solely in children's space, but something that I think is quite interesting in terms of tech is things like Mozilla's kind of open badges. So I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's how you can attribute kind of learning to any skills that you can pick up anywhere online, and young people can earn these badges through participating in content, etc. And you can also actually dispense badges as a teacher or yourself. I think there's something really interesting in terms of how we can use that in marketing to engage young people through content, and what kind of applications that can have, particularly when we're talking about some of the things earlier, like kind of low literacy levels and educational publishing. So I'm just really interested to see how kind of that will not revolutionise, but kind of will change the way that we're using content.
Well, it's a pretty old school idea, isn't it? It's like star charts, basically, but using it digitally.
Yeah, but online, but and as you were saying, kind of, the internet is not one space. Young people are kind of moving in and out of kind of very multi-layered. So actually something that can kind of follow you and that you can pick up in different spaces, but is kind of universally recognised, just feels really interesting.
Okay. Joe?
Something that's interesting for lots of reasons, but is in some ways traditional, is a show that we've just commissioned for CBBC that's going to go out at the end of the summer about life in the first year of a secondary school. And I think it's interesting for lots of reasons. One is it will remind you that change from primary school to secondary school is still a key moment for children when you go from being the biggest of the small ones to the smallest of the big ones. And I think that is why CBBC refocused itself to stop at 12, because there is, of all the arbitrary lines in different developmental periods, that change from primary school to secondary school is fascinating. It's made by the people who made Educating Essex and Educating Yorkshire on the same fixed rig system of putting hundreds of cameras in a place, letting them film, and then working out what the story is afterwards. So it's an interesting example of children's media adopting modern forms. There wouldn't have been shows like that on the telly when I was a kid, partly because the technology wasn't there and partly because it wasn't the way to do things. So I think it's an interesting modern form of some traditional storytelling, which also is fascinating. You look at that programme, I watched 3 episodes of it last night. Children at primary school have the same worries, the same fears, the same needs, the same concerns as children always have, and I think that's a useful corrective to some of the worries.
And I'm going to go to Roy, I think, next.
I'm really excited and intrigued by what the likes of Tokaboka, I don't know whether people are familiar with Tokaboka, but they make apps for children who are very successful in that marketplace. They're now looking to extend that into TV and consumer products and books, and how that will translate, whether those experiences will stack up as stories and films in the same way, I guess, as Mind Candy are starting to do with Moshi Monsters and things like the Moshi Monster movie, and also Mattel and their move towards 3D printing of personalised toys. I think they've taken something that could potentially erode their business model, which is making physical toys, and are potentially creating something quite special.
And Matt.
You should talk to Makey Lab if you're interested in that. I think Martha, you should get Martha to talk about Makey Lab later on. Came from Alice Taylor, who used to work with me at Channel 4, so very pleased about that. I'm such a Minecraft geek, and I love Minecraft. Because my two daughters do. I kind of played it when it first came out as a game, when it was kind of being targeted at geeky adults. And to see its adoption by kids has just been fantastic. And in particular, because that adoption's been driven by its Lego-like qualities rather than its story qualities. So my daughter started playing it because everyone at school was talking about Minecraft. And I love the fact that there are still these kind of playground, you know, the playground is the most important social context for very young children. It still really, really is. And I love it because it's kind of teaching them that, you know, the world behind these screens are fungible and playable with in ways that, you know, is really fundamental, I think, for them to kind of understand the world they're living in. You know, they both use Scratch as well. I mean, I'm a geek, so I do kind of put these things in front of them. But a lot of this is really driven by themselves, like expecting to be able to kind of play with stuff and to actually, you know, mess around with media and to change it and to kind of tell their own stories with it. And that's, I think, what really, really excites me at the moment is that, you know, these brilliant stories, which we're lucky enough, particularly in the UK and with the BBC, to have these amazing storytellers creating fantastic content for kids. But what really excites me is this growing expectation in kids is that those stories are things that you can engage with and play with. You know, the best form of education is always participation. You know, you can't really learn something until you've kind of got under the hood and played with it. And I'm just really excited seeing, you know, something like Minecraft coming along, teaching kids in ways that for me are just completely liberating and inspiring.
And I would suggest that idea about playing with stories and creating your own stories, that is a perpetual idea, and that's always happened. And I do bedtime stories with my little boys, and they make the story up. We read the book once, and then they craft it themselves. So it seems to me that, you know, the big moments are still big moments, and stories are still important, and the key things are still there, and technology is just helping and amplifying it. And actually, maybe it's not about reaching the kids effectively, but as Rory said, you know, reaching the rest of us effectively and letting us not panic about what it is the kids are doing. We can't really scratch the surface of this, I think, in the time, but I'm pleased with what we've managed to do. So thank you so much, panellists. I think that was incredibly interesting. And we have next Michael Healy from the Copyright Clearance Centre. So thank you.